welcome. We've been on a journey over the last 4 weeks looking at some of the women who were literally behind the story of Christmas, right? In the Gospel of Matthew, he records for us a genealogy of Jesus' lineage. And in that genealogy, he includes 4 women, which was an unprecedented move for someone in an ancient patriarchal society to do, to include a woman in a genealogy. Not only does he do this, though, these aren't typical women in the sense that this is an Israelite genealogy, and every one of these women is a Gentile. And so this is a bold move. And so we've been asking ourselves, well, why does Matthew do this? Why does he include these women's stories by mentioning their names in his genealogy? And basically, what Matthew wants us to catch is that each one of these stories tells us something that he wants us to catch about the birth and the mission of Jesus. Say that again. Each one of the stories that's represented by the women's names that he includes, Matthew includes them because he wants us to catch something from their story that is relevant or transferable into the birth and the story and the mission of Jesus. And the final X factor that we're looking at this morning is a young woman by the name of Ruth. Everyone say Ruth. Ruth. Say it again, Ruth. There we go, love it. So, why don't we, hey, we're allowed to have fun in church, amen? Good, especially on Christmas, come on. Man, those adults singing those karaoke stuff, that'll go down as one of my favorite things. All right, so let's read together the story of Ruth found in, well, some of it, don't fear, it won't be the whole thing, starting in verse 1 of chapter 1 of Ruth. If you've got a Bible, turn to Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, or follow along on the screen. Kicks off with this. In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife was Naomi. Their 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. And when they reached Moab, they settled there. Then Elimelech died, and Naomi was left with her 2 sons. The 2 sons married 2 Moabite women. One married a woman named Orpah, the other a woman named Ruth. But about 10 years later, both Mahlon and Chilion died. This left Naomi alone without her 2 sons or her husband. We keep reading, verse 6. Then Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had blessed his people in Judah by giving them good crops again. So Naomi and her daughters-in-law got ready to leave Moab to return for her homeland. All right, so this is the scene. Elimelech has taken his family off to Moab. And what you need to understand is that Moab was Israelites' enemy. Everyone say enemy. Look at your neighbor and say enemy. But don't get in trouble. Look at your other neighbor and say, I love you. I hope that's an appropriate, depending on who your neighbor is. So, this is the context. Elimelech has taken his family. He's left Bethlehem, which interestingly enough, in the Hebrew, Bethlehem means house of bread, right? He's left the house of bread, the place of provision, and he's wandered off to enemy territory because he's not trusting God that God is going to provide. And he gets to Moab, and one thing leads to another, and the bloke dies. But while they're there, Naomi manages to get 2 daughter-in-laws for her sons, making them husbands. We got there. But funnily enough, 10 years past, the text says, and her sons also die. All right, so there's this trio now of women left with no husbands. And we keep reading the story after they decide that they're going to head back to Judah because they've got a report that, funnily enough, the house of bread Yahweh has provided, and actually there is provisions back in Bethlehem. Verse 8. On the way, Naomi sent to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back to your mother's homes, and may the Lord reward you for your kindness to your husbands and to me. May the Lord bless you with security of another marriage." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they all broke down and wept. "No," they said, "we want to go with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Why should you go with me? Can I still give birth to another son who could grow up and be husbands for you?" Verse 12. "No, my daughters. Return to your parents' home, for I too am too old to marry, and even if it were possible, I were to get married tonight and bear sons, then what? Would you wait for them to grow up and refuse to marry someone else? No, of course not, my daughters. Things are far more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord himself has raised his fist against me." And again they wept together, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. "Look," Naomi said to her, "your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same." But Ruth replied, "Don't ask me to leave you and turn back. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me severely if I allow anything but death to separate us." When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she said nothing more. I wonder this morning if you've ever been the recipient of a profound gesture of love. You ever been the recipient of a profound gesture of love? I remember when I was about 15 or 16, and I was growing up, and I've just got to lay some context to this story. I was at that age as a teenager where I was more closer to a man, right? A young man than I was a teenager, right? At 15 or 16, you're pretty big, you're pretty hefty. It's not a kid, right, in this story. And I was also going through a season of my life where me and my dad, let's just say we butt heads, right? Often. And, pretty rambunctiously. Now, I grew up in the good old days, right, where smacking kids was okay. Any parents miss those days? Don't put your hand up. You get in serious trouble. I grew up in the good old days where there was a degree of physicality in parenting, right? And it wasn't, especially in my house, it wasn't abusive, but there was a sense that it was used in discipline. And this was very much the household that I grew up in. And so I would get the wooden spoon. Anyone have a wooden spoon in their family? If I really got in trouble, I got Dad's belt, right? And I was in this particular season where, I don't know why, but I would really test my dad. I would do my best to get under his skin, to goad him. And if you have any struggles in imagining how annoying I could be goading him, just talk to my wife, right? You see, I was the youngest of 3 brothers, and so compared to my older brothers, I didn't have a lot of physical strength. And so I learned to use my noggin, and I learned to use my words. And I was very good at it, ashamedly. And I remember in this season, I would particularly press Dad's buttons on purpose. And I remember this one particular day, I think, I'm not 100% sure. I unfortunately did a lot of things I regret growing up, but I think I had stolen my brother's car, and I'd also damaged it in the process. I'd also put my life in danger. I didn't have a license. The car was, not even registered. And it's fair to say Dad was pretty furious, right? And I remember us having this altercation. Him telling me off. And I remember getting up in his grill, pushing him. I remember getting quite physical. In fact, I remember using my words and them not having the desired effect that I wanted on Dad. He wasn't losing his cool, and I wanted him to. And so I remember I did something that I'd never done before and I never did since. And I actually took a swing at my dad. I took a swing at him. And I connected in his head, the back of his head. And can I just say, Dad saw red, right? He was angry. And he started charging at me like, I know my dad and I trust my dad. He wouldn't have abused me. He would have put me in a good old headlock or something and given me a good kick up the backside. But I just remember I'd never seen Dad that angry in my life. And as he went to pursue me, after I had been in the wrong and I had totally instigated and caused violence toward him, all of a sudden, my mum stepped in. You see, we were yelling and we were shouting, and like I said, there was a degree of physicality. And you've got to know something about my mum. She's not a unit, all right? She's this little petite thing, particularly back when she was in her late 50s or whenever it was. She, 45 kilos at best. She is not a large or strong woman. But I never forget, as Dad is angry as anything and charging at me, ready to grab me or shove me or something, I'll never forget Mum completely embracing me, wrapping her arms and her body and turning around to face my dad and saying, if you want to touch him, you've got to come through me. And I remember that was just, he was this petite, Mum was a lot smaller than me. And here was this mum, here was my mum, prepared to put her body on the line to protect me, even though I was in the wrong. And there was something very special about this gesture of love that you typically don't see in love, right? See, love is typically what I call one-dimensional. And what I mean by that is when you receive some epic gift of generosity, that love is expressed one-dimensionally in the generosity, right? When someone comes to mow your lawns or does some thoughtful act of service, that love is expressed one-dimensionally, right, in that thoughtfulness. When someone, declares their love for you, maybe in a marriage proposal, maybe sticking up for you at school, and they risk their neck publicly for you, right? That love is expressed in that moment one-dimensionally as this boldness and as this courage. Does that make sense? But the love that I experienced from my mum that night was something very different. You see, it wasn't one-dimensional. It was this amalgamation of a few different things. Sure, it was love, right? It was this tangible expression of goodness or kindness given purely for my sake. Yes, it was love, but it was more than that. You see, this love, this expression had this element of devotion in it. It had this element of, you know what, that's my kid, and rain, hail, or shine, I've got his back. It wasn't just love, it had this element of devotion. But it also had another element. It had this element of compassion in it. You see, Mum knew that I was in the wrong, right? I'd stolen a car, I'd taken a swing at Dad, and yet there was this element of her love that she wasn't prepared for me to suffer the consequences of it, even though I deserved it. There was this element of compassion or mercy in her love. And this multifaceted concoction of love that had love, compassion, and devotion all rolled into one, well, this is the kind of love that actually we come across in our story. You see, Naomi has become a widow, right? And if you're familiar with the Bible, you will know that there are two categories of people that God takes special interest in, right? They're the fatherless and the what? The widow. Exodus 22, verse 22 says this: do not take advantage of the widow or the fatherless. Deuteronomy 10:18 says, he defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow. Deuteronomy 24:19 says, when you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the who? The fatherless and the widow. Psalm 68 verse 5 says, that talking about God, he says that he is the father to the fatherless, defender of the widows. This is God. Isaiah 1:17 says, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, and plead the case of the what? The widow. The Apostle James says in the first chapter of his letter, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this. Are you ready for it? To look after the fatherless and the who? The widow in their distress. You know why God cares or cared particularly in that day so much for the widow? You know why he cared so much for the widow? I'll tell you. Because in the ancient world, if you didn't have a dad, if you didn't have a husband, guess what? You were stuffed, capital S. Like you had no way without a husband or without a dad to protect yourself as a woman or to provide for yourself. You were stuffed. And this is what Naomi is facing in our story. She's a widow. Like there is literally a huge chance that Naomi doesn't actually make it. That's not me being melodramatic. That is what would happen to widows in the ancient world. At best, Naomi has to look forward to a life moving forward that's probably characterized by exploitation, torment, and abuse. And so she does, honestly, what was probably the only responsible thing to do in her situation. And she says to her daughters-in-law, go back to your home country. Go back to your family. Because while they were all widows, while these two younger women were themselves widows, they were young, right? And so what does that mean? They have a very good chance to remarry. But do you know what else it means? It means guess who's waiting for them at home? Their father. A male who could provide and protect and give them the provision that they need. And so one of Naomi's daughter-in-laws does this, right? She does the sensible thing. Orpah, verse 14, we read, and again, they wept together, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung tightly to Naomi. Look, Naomi said to her, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. You should do the same. But she doesn't, does she? No, what does Ruth do? Well, instead, Ruth does a Will Smith.
We ride together. We die together. Bad boys for life.
That's what Ruth does, right? A modern paraphrase. She offers this epic gesture of devotion, but I want you to catch this. It's an epic gesture of devotion that's mixed with compassion, that's also mixed with love. In fact, if you continue the story, you realize Ruth is not a one and done girl, right? She's not a one and done girl. This is not just some one thing that she did once. No, if you follow her story literally goes from one epic, compassionate, loyal devotion act to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And the Bible actually has a special word for this type of love. Do you know what it is? It's the Hebrew word hesed. Everyone say with me, chesed. Got to imagine you're clearing your throat. 3, 2, 1, chesed. There you go. It's a complex word, right? There's no exact match in the English because it has these 3 concurrent ideas baked into it, right? Love, loyalty, and compassion or mercy. All three of these things is baked into this idea of chesed. And if I were to summarize the book of Ruth in one word, do you know what it would be? The book of Ruth is simply about this: chesed. That's what the story of Ruth is about. The book of Ruth is about this special kind of love, chesed. It's a story all about Naomi being the object of chesed love, the object of Ruth's undeserved or compassionate, loyal, loving devotion. That's what Ruth is about. You see, Naomi has done absolutely nothing, right, to warrant this level of sacrifice and commitment from Ruth, right? Naomi's done nothing to warrant that. There's certainly nothing in it for Ruth. There's nothing in it for Ruth. She's not going to get anything out of this unwavering, loyal devotion toward Naomi, especially when at times it literally means risking her own life and her own well-being. But that's why this story is about chesed and not mutual affection. That's why this story is about chesed love and not just about kindness, even profound kindness. Because baked into Ruth's love for Naomi is a loyal commitment, an unwavering devotion that's not based on anything Ruth might gain or Naomi might have done, but it's based completely on compassion and undeserved mercy. And here's the connection that Matthew, who wrote the gospel and that genealogy, wants us to catch by including Ruth's story in his genealogy of Jesus. Are you ready? That Jesus' story is also a story about chesed. The birth of Jesus is ultimately all about the manifestation of God's chesed love. But here is the difference, and I want you to catch this. Where Ruth's story is all about chesed love for a widow named Naomi, Jesus' birth is all about God's chesed love for you and I. And if you catch nothing else this Christmas, I pray you catch this truth. That there is a God in heaven who knows your name, who loves you, who made you, who has a plan and a purpose for your life. And he has the kind of love for you that's chesed. A love that's not based on your performance, a love that's not dependent on your reciprocation, the kind of love that is completely loyal and devoted to you no matter what you do and no matter what you think about him. That's God's chesed love for you. But this is what I want you to leave you with this morning. Lean in. Ruth shows this epic display of chesed love toward Naomi. However, everyone say however, when Naomi gets back to her hometown, only 24 hours after finding herself, right, the object of this incredible, compassionate, loving devotion, I want you to look at what she says. Verse 19, it says this: "So the two of them continued on their journey. When they came to Bethlehem, the entire town was excited by their arrival." Is it really Naomi? The women asked. And this is what she says. "Don't call me Naomi," she responded. "Instead, call me Mara," which means bitter. "For the Almighty has made my life very bitter." I want you to see this. Naomi is so caught up in herself. She's so caught up in her feelings of brokenness, in her present moment, in her busyness, in her distraction, that she fails to recognize that she, Naomi, has been the object of this completely undeserved, incredible chesed love. That she's ultimately been the object through Ruth, right, of God's chesed love. She doesn't see it. And here's the point I want you to catch. You can be the object of chesed love. Listen to this. You can be the object of chesed love, of God's chesed love, but unless you choose to see it and unless you choose to receive it, it will not transform your life. You can be the object, you are the object of God's incredible chesed love for you. In fact, Jesus' birth, Christmas Day, the reason that we celebrate is all about this love. But my prayer for you this Christmas is that unlike Naomi, who is the object of God's chesed love, but fails to see it, fails to receive it, and therefore fails to have it transform her life. My prayer for you this Christmas is that you would see, that you would receive, and that ultimately God's chesed love would transform your life. Amen. Let's pray.